The air in the anchor and chain was a thick, layered thing, a geological strata of maritime history. The lowest, oldest layer was the smell of stale beer and spilled whiskey, a scent that had so thoroughly soaked into the dark wood of the floor and bar that it had become a structural element. Above that lay the sharper, more recent deposit of fried food, salt, and the faint metallic tang of diesel fuel that drifted in from the docks every time the heavy oak door swung open. The top layer was a haze of blue-gray cigarette smoke, a ghost of a bygone era, clinging to the low, nicotine-stained ceiling, where yellowed photographs of forgotten destroyers and decommissioned aircraft carriers curled at the edges. The only light came from the jaundiced glow of neon beer signs and the dusty, low-wattage bulbs hanging over the pool tables, casting long, distorted shadows that made every corner seem deeper and every face more weary. It was a place built for endings, the end of a deployment, the end of a paycheck, or simply the end of a long, hard day wrestling with the indifferent sea. In a booth in the darkest corner, away from the boisterous laughter and the sharp crack of colliding billiard balls, sat a woman. She was an island of stillness in the bar's choppy human sea. Had anyone bothered to truly look at her, they would have seen little to remark upon. She was of average height, with a build that suggested economy rather than strength, and her features were plain in the way of things designed for function over form. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe knot, and she wore unremarkable civilian clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater that seemed to absorb the already dim light. She held a glass of water, condensation beating on its sides, and she nursed it with a slow, deliberate patience, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the grime-streaked window that looked out onto the naval base. Her posture was perfect, a straight line of discipline in a room full of slouching bodies, but it was a quiet discipline, an internal framework that went unnoticed. She was not hiding, but she was profoundly unseen, a ghost at the feast. She was Lieutenant Commander Anya Sharma, and she was waiting. The feast, such as it was, belonged to Lieutenant Rick Thorne and his cohort. They had stormed the anchor and chain an hour ago, a conquering force of youth, muscle, and unshakable confidence. They were Navy SEALs, fresh from a successful training evolution that had, in their minds, once again affirmed their status as the sharpened tip of the military spear. Thorne, callsign Jester, was their nexus. He was a man sculpted from the very archetype of a special operator. Tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his t-shirt, and a face that looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, all sharp angles and a jawline that could cut glass. He moved with the predatory grace of an apex athlete, and his voice, a confident baritone, sliced through the bar's ambient roar with the ease of a commander's edict. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace, but it was the loud, declarative authority of a bonfire, not the quiet, immense pressure of a star. He and his men occupied the center of the room, their laughter the loudest, their stories the most dramatic, their presence a gravitational force that pulled the attention of everyone else into their orbit. The initial confrontation, when it came, was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping tide of arrogance. Thorne, holding court at the bar, was telling a story that involved a helicopter, a hostile coastline, and his own singular brilliance. His eyes, sweeping the room for an audience, snagged on the still figure in the corner booth. He saw not a person, but an anomaly, an unsolved variable in his controlled environment. He saw a woman alone, small and unimpressed. This was a combination of factors his worldview could not easily process. His narrative faltered for a half-second before he incorporated her into it, using her as a prop. "Of course," he boomed, gesturing vaguely in her direction with his beer bottle. "Not everyone understands that kind of pressure. Some people spend their whole careers just floating around, polishing brass, and giving out speeding tickets to pleasure boaters." His men chuckled on cue. The insult was broad, impersonal, but its vector was clear. He was fishing, trolling the waters of the room for a reaction. Anya Sharma gave him none. Her eyes, which had been looking out the window, shifted. They did not meet his, but instead tracked a bead of condensation as it traced a path down the side of her glass. The lack of response was more galling to Thorne than any angry retort could have been. It was a dismissal. He had launched a missile, and she had not even bothered to register the impact. His ego, a sensitive and finely tuned instrument, registered this as a direct challenge. He left his men and swaggered over to her booth, his boots loud on the worn floorboards. He loomed over her, a mountain of smug certainty casting a shadow over her small table. "Something wrong with my story, ma'am?" he asked, the word ma'am dripping with a condescending sweetness that was thicker and more cloying than the stale air. Anya Sharma finally lifted her head. Her eyes were a dark, indeterminate color in the gloom, and her expression was one of mild, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a peculiar insect. "I was not listening to your story, Lieutenant," she said. Her voice was calm, level, and devoid of any emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. The use of his rank, however, was a surprise. It was a small, sharp jab that suggested she was not the civilian he had assumed. But to Thorne, it was merely a confirmation that she was in the service, which made her perceived slight even worse. She was one of them, and she was still unimpressed. "Oh, you weren't?" he sneered, leaning his hands on her table, invading her space. The smell of beer and masculine pride washed over her. "Let me guess. Coast Guard?" He said the words like a diagnosis of a terminal, slightly embarrassing disease. "Yeah, you have that puddle pirate look about you. What do? Drive the Admiral's barge around the harbor?" He was playing to the crowd now. His men were watching, grinning. The other patrons, smelling the blood in the water, had turned to observe the spectacle. The bartender paused in his polishing of a glass. This was a classic institutional drama, the kind that played out in dockside bars from Norfolk to San Diego. The arrogant combat operator putting a REMF, a rear echelon motherfucker, in their place. Anya's response was, once again, a profound and unnerving nothing. She did not flinch. She did not turn. She simply held his gaze. It was like watching a lioness allow a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, utterly unconcerned by the yapping and posturing. This infuriating calm was a vacuum, and Thorne's bluster rushed in to fill it. "What, cat got your tongue? Or are you just not used to being around real warriors?" He tapped a finger against the trident insignia tattooed on his forearm. "See this? This means something. This means I've been to the bad places. It means I do the hard things so people like you can play sailor." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. "Face it. What you do, whatever it is, it's nothing. SEALs are nothing to me." He meant, of course, that her service, her entire world, was nothing in comparison to his. It was a declaration of cosmic insignificance, delivered with the absolute certainty of a zealot. With a final flourish of contempt, he flicked the side of her water glass with his finger. It was a petty, childish gesture, but it was a physical act. A line had been crossed. The glass tipped, spilling a pool of ice water across the scarred surface of the table. The water dripped onto the floor with a quiet, rhythmic patter that was suddenly the loudest sound in the now silent bar. Anya Sharma looked down at the spilled water. Then she looked back up at him. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in her eyes. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was pity. She reached out, not toward him, but toward the stack of coarse napkins on the table. With a slow, precise movement, she began to soak up the spill, her actions as deliberate and economical as if she were disarming a bomb. She did not say a word. And then the world ended. It began not with a bang, but with a sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The lights in the bar flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into absolute blackness. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Before panic could set in, the emergency lights kicked on, casting the room in a hellish, pulsating red glow. Simultaneously, every phone in the room began to shriek with an emergency alert, a cacophony of digital screams. But above it all was the wind. It was not the sound of a storm. It was the sound of a jet engine, a solid wall of noise that hit the building with the force of a physical blow. The windows of the anchor and chain, thick, salt-streaked panes that had withstood decades of gales, bowed inward, creaking under an impossible pressure. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the front door was ripped from its hinges and cartwheeled into the street. A savage, horizontal rain, mixed with salt spray and debris, blasted into the room. The sirens began to wail across the naval base, a rising, falling chorus of pure technological terror. This was not a drill. This was not a storm. This was a meteorological event of apocalyptic violence, a microburst or a squall line of unprecedented fury that had materialized out of nowhere, a monster leaping from the sea. The bar emptied in a chaotic surge. Training instinct in duty took over. Sailors and Marines, Thorne and his SEALs included, scrambled out into the maelstrom, their personal dramas forgotten, replaced by the primal urgency of the crisis. Thorne was in his element, or so he thought. He sprinted towards the piers, his body low against the hurricane-force wind that threatened to lift him off his feet. The air was a chaotic soup of rain and flying objects. The world was noise and violence. This was the language he understood. But when he reached the main pier, what he saw was a kind of chaos for which his training had no answer. This was not a firefight. This was a battle against physics, against the raw, untamable power of nature. The USS Defiance, an R. Lee Burke-class destroyer, a 10,000-ton mountain of gray steel and advanced weaponry, had broken its moorings. The thick steel cable lines, as thick as a man's thigh, had snapped with reports like cannon fire. The colossal ship was adrift in the narrow channel, being pushed by the wind and waves. It was a battering ram of unimaginable force, and it was sliding inexorably sideways towards Pier 7, where a nuclear submarine was berthed. And beyond that, the base's primary fuel depot. The potential for catastrophe was not just high, it was absolute. Panic was a palpable thing on the pier. The port operations officer was screaming into a radio, his voice cracking with hysteria. The skeleton crew aboard the Defiance were visible as tiny, helpless figures on the deck, their movements frantic and useless. The base's tugboats, powerful as they were like terriers trying to herd a rampaging elephant. They were pushed aside by the waves, their engines screaming in protest, their efforts utterly futile, giant against the combined momentum of the destroyer and the storm. Thorne stood there, a weapon without a target, a warrior without a war to fight. His skills in close-quarters combat, in reconnaissance, in direct action, were as useless here as a feather in a hurricane. He watched, horrified and impotent, as the disaster unfolded in slow, inexorable motion. It was into this tableau of chaos and despair that Anya Sharma walked. She seemed to have materialized from the storm itself, now clad in dark blue, foul-weather gear that shed the wind and rain. She wore no rank, no insignia, but she moved with a purpose that was a stark contrast to the frantic energy around her. Her walk was not a run, but a swift, economical stride that seemed to ignore the force of the wind. In her hand, she held a standard Navy handheld radio she must have acquired from a panicked sailor. She did not look at the chaos. She seemed to be looking through it, at the complex interlocking puzzle of wind, water, and steel. She stopped at the edge of the pier, planting her feet in a wide, stable stance. She raised the radio to her lips, and she began to speak. Her voice, when it cut through the static-filled chaos of the primary channel, was an impossible thing. It was calm. It was measured. It was utterly, terrifyingly confident. It was the voice of a surgeon in the middle of a complex operation, a voice that did not allow for panic or doubt. "All stations, this is Watcher," she said, using a call sign no one recognized. "Break, break, Defiance Bridge. Do you read me?" A panicked voice came back from the destroyer. "This is the Defiance, dude. We have no control. We've lost all moorings. We are drifting." "I see that, officer of the deck," Anya's voice replied, with a faint trace of professional impatience. "Now listen to me. What is your current rudder angle?" "Rudder? It's amidships. We have no steerage way." "You have the wind and you have your engines. That is more than enough," she stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Her voice became a staccato burst of commands, a foreign language of expertise that silenced everyone on the channel. "Port operations. I want a real-time anemometer reading from the main mast now. Defiance Bridge, bring your rudder to full right standard. I want a 5-second burst from your port screw, ahead 1/3. Give me a 20-degree cant to starboard. Use the wind on your port quarter as a sail." There was a moment of stunned silence from the destroyer. The order was counterintuitive, insane. It involved turning the ship into the path of destruction, using the engines in a way that no textbook would ever advise. "Watcher, who is this? What is your authority?" the OOD demanded. Anya's voice lost its calm and took on a razor's edge. "My authority is that I am the only person on this channel who can keep your ship from breaking in half on that fuel pier. You have 10 seconds to execute, or I will have you relieved for cause. Now move." On the pier, Thorne and the others stared, mouths agape. They could not believe what they were hearing. A woman, an unknown, had just seized de facto command of a United States Navy destroyer in the middle of a crisis. But then they saw it. The massive rudder of the Defiance began to turn. A plume of white water erupted from its port side as the screw bit into the churning harbor. The colossal ship, which had been sliding sideways like a dead thing, began to pivot. It was a slow, groaning movement, the protest of 10,000 tons of steel being forced to dance. But it was happening. For the next 15 minutes, Anya Sharma conducted a symphony of salvation. Her radio was her baton, and the destroyer, the tugboats, and the storm itself were her orchestra. Her commands were a torrent of technical mastery. She spoke of Venturi effects, of bow thrusters, of ballast shifts and cycloidal propulsion. She directed the two struggling tugboats not to push against the destroyer's flank, but to act as outboard rudders, one pulling the bow, the other nudging the stern, turning the ship into the wind. She was using the storm's own power against it, deflecting its force, channeling its energy. She was playing three-dimensional chess in a hurricane, anticipating every wave, calculating every gust, her mind a supercomputer of maritime physics. The men on the pier, Thorne included, were no longer participants. They were spectators at a masterclass they could not begin to comprehend. They watched as the USS Defiance, under the precise remote control guidance of this anonymous woman, stopped its deadly slide. It stabilized, its bow now pointing into the wind, holding its position against the storm's fury like a trained animal brought to heel. The immediate danger had passed. The ship was holding steady, waiting for the lines to be resecured. The ballet was over. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one in the bar. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated awe. The wind still howled, but it seemed to have lost its menace. In the center of it all stood the woman in the dark gear, the radio now hanging limply from her hand. It was at that moment that a black command vehicle, sirens silent but lights flashing, screeched to a halt at the head of the pier. The rear door flew open and out stepped Rear Admiral Hayes. This home matter of the entire naval base. He was a man whose face was a permanent mask of grim responsibility, and tonight it was etched with deep lines of fear. He strode onto the pier, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the stabilized destroyer, the exhausted tug crews, and the small figure standing alone at the pier's edge. His eyes widened, a look of dawning comprehension, of disbelief, and then of profound relief washed over his face. He did not shout, he did not run. He walked directly toward Anya Sharma, his steps measured and purposeful. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. The other officers and sailors on the pier, including Thorne, watched, confused. Then the Admiral did something that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with an audible click, and rendered the sharpest, most profound salute of his long and decorated career. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a subordinate. It was the crisp, reverent salute one gives to a legend or to a monarch. "Commander Sharma," the Admiral's voice boomed, cutting through the wind. "I should have known. When they told me some unknown civilian had taken command of the channel, I should have known it was you. On behalf of every soul on this base, thank you. We were minutes from a catastrophe." The name and rank descended upon the pier like a physical weight. Commander, not lieutenant, not some junior officer from the Coast Guard. Commander. Rick Thorne's mind reeled. The woman he had belittled, the woman he had dismissed as a puddle pirate, was a full commander. He had publicly humiliated a senior officer. His career was over. But the confusion was still there. A commander doing what? What kind of commander possessed that almost supernatural skill? He must have spoken the question aloud, or perhaps his face was just that easy to read. An old Master Chief Petty Officer, A man with skin like tan leather and eyes that had seen everything the sea could offer stepped beside him. He had been watching the entire spectacle with a look of dawning, almost religious reverence. "Son," the Master Chief said, his voice low and gravelly, never taking his eyes off Sharma, "you have no idea what you just saw. That's not just a commander. That's Anya Sharma." The name meant nothing to Thorne. The Master Chief seemed to understand this. "You're too young, you wouldn't know," he continued, his tone that of a historian reciting an epic poem. "They call her the helmsman. She's Coast Guard, yeah, but on loan to Naval Special Projects, she's the one they call when God himself has decided a ship needs to sink. She's the one who piloted the crippled USS Stalwart through a Category 5 typhoon in the South China Sea after its navigation and rudder controls were shot out. She's the one who boarded a burning supertanker off the coast of Alaska and steered it away from the shoreline using nothing but differential engine thrust and a handheld GPS. That black belt you SEALs talk about? Hers is an unlimited tonnage master mariner's license for any ocean, a qualification maybe 5 people on the planet have. She's a graduate of Project Icarus, the joint program for transcendental seamanship. They don't teach you how to drive a ship. They teach you how to become the ship." The Master Chief finally turned to look at Thorne, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and scorn. "You didn't just insult an officer, Lieutenant. You walked into a church, spat on the altar, and told Michelangelo he didn't know how to paint. She didn't react to you in that bar because you weren't even on her radar. A mountain doesn't concern itself with the opinion of a barking dog." The world had reordered itself around Rick Thorne. The solid ground of his own competence and superiority had dissolved into a churning sea of humiliation. He was the jackal. He was the barking dog. He was nothing. Hours later, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Thorne stood at a rigid, trembling attention in the center of Admiral Hayes's spacious office. He was still in his salt-stiffened, damp clothes. He felt like a child who had been caught playing with matches after burning down the house. Across the wide mahogany desk, Admiral Hayes sat, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. And in a chair to the side, impossibly, sat Commander Anya Sharma. She was in a dry, crisp service dress uniform now, the silver oak leaf of a commander gleaming on her collar. She looked just as unassuming as she had in the bar, a fact that was somehow more terrifying than if she had been a giant. "Lieutenant Thorne," the Admiral began, his voice dangerously soft, "I have your entire service record here. It's exemplary. Gallantry awards, glowing fitness reports, a shining career. Which is why I am finding it very difficult to reconcile that record with the fact that you publicly, and with extreme prejudice, harassed and assaulted a senior officer. An act which, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, could see you stripped of your rank, your trident, and your career. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Thorne's throat was dry. He swallowed hard. "No, sir. No excuse, sir." His own voice sounded thin and pathetic to his ears. The Admiral glared at him for a long, punishing moment. "I am prepared to make an example of you, Lieutenant, to send a message that this kind of Neanderthal arrogance has no place in the modern Navy." It was then that Sharma spoke. Her voice, once again, was calm and devoid of anger. "Admiral, I would request you do not do that." Both Hayes and Thorne looked at her in surprise. She turned her chair slightly to face Thorne, her expression not one of forgiveness, but of academic analysis. What the lieutenant did was not an act of malice. It was a critical intelligence failure. He encountered an unknown variable, and instead of observing and assessing, he made an assumption based on incomplete and biased data. My gender, my perceived service branch, my quiet demeanor. He then acted on that flawed assumption with disproportionate aggression. In my world, Admiral, that kind of failure doesn't lead to a bar fight. It leads to a shipwreck. It gets people killed. She held Thorne's gaze. His punishment should not be punitive. It should be educational. She turned back to the Admiral. "Sir, I request that Lieutenant Thorne be temporarily assigned to my command for the next 6 months. He will serve as my aide-de-camp. He needs to learn that the world is more complex than a gunfight. He needs to learn how to see the entire board, not just the square he's standing on." Admiral Hayes stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a brilliant, elegant solution. It was not punishment, it was re-education. It was a sentence far more profound and transformative than any brig time could ever be. It was forced proximity to the very competence he had mocked. An outstanding recommendation, Commander, the Admiral said, his good humor restored. He looked at the pale, shell-shocked face of the SEAL. Congratulations, Lieutenant. You are about to receive the most valuable education of your entire naval career. Report to Commander Sharma at 0600 tomorrow. Dismissed. The story of that night, of the storm, the destroyer, and the quiet commander, passed into the annals of naval base lore. It became a modern fable, a teaching tool passed down from salty master chiefs to cocky new ensigns. With each telling, the storm grew more violent, the ship larger, and Commander Sharma's commands more brilliant. The legend grew as legends do, but the core of it, the essential truth, remained unchanged. It was a story about the difference between perceived strength and actual strength, between loud confidence and quiet competence. Years later, at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, a new class of SEAL candidates, the best and brightest of their generation, sat in a lecture hall. They were young, strong, and brimming with the same arrogant confidence that Rick Thorne had once possessed. At the front of the room stood their instructor, a man known for his tactical brilliance, but also for his unexpected humility. Captain Rick Thorne was a different man now. The hard edges of his youth had been worn smooth, not by combat, but by 6 months of carrying Commander Sharma's briefcase. 6 months of watching her diffuse international incidents with a quiet phone call, rewrite naval doctrine on a laptop, and command the respect of admirals and foreign dignitaries with nothing more than her quiet, unshakable competence. He had learned to see the whole board. He leaned against the lectern and looked at the faces of the young warriors before him. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room. "It's a story about a time I was the toughest, strongest, most highly trained man in a room. And it's a story about how I was also the biggest fool." He told them about the bar, about his own arrogance, about the woman in the corner. He told them about the storm and the destroyer. He did not spare himself. He painted himself as the villain of the story, the cautionary tale, and when he was finished, a profound silence filled the room. "Your physical prowess, your weapons training, your tactical skills," he told them, his voice resonating with the conviction of a convert. "They make you dangerous, but they do not, by themselves, make you strong. True strength, the kind that can stop a 10,000-ton destroyer in a hurricane, the kind that can change the world, is often quiet. It is intellectual. It is disciplined. It is the mastery of a craft so total that it becomes an art form. Your biggest threat is not the enemy you can see. It is your own assumption about the enemy. You can't. Never, ever assume you are the most dangerous person in the room." The ultimate lesson of that stormy night was not about the humbling of one arrogant man. It was a broader, more universal truth. Strength has many forms, and the most potent is rarely the most visible. The warrior who wins the battle is celebrated, and rightly so. But the architect who designed the fortress, the engineer who forged the steel, the quiet master who sees the subtle currents of the wind and tide, their strength is of a different order. It is the strength of substance over style, of action over words. It is the quiet, unshakable authority of true competence. It is a reminder that in the grand, chaotic ocean of human endeavor, the most powerful forces are not the crashing waves on the surface, but the deep, silent currents that move the world. They are the ones you never see coming, and they need no introduction. Their actions are their argument,